You've tuned into Radio Northern Beaches. We live stream on rnb.org.au across the northern beaches of New South Wales, Australia and all over the world. You can also catch us local on 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Our podcasts are available at your convenience at rnb.org.au or rnbpodcast.com. So you and your friends don't miss any episodes. Don't forget to follow and share. Now here's our latest podcast.
Hello again, listeners. Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7, 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. Our program is Innovation Talk, and I'm Michael Lester. I guess I could start today by quoting Dorothea McKellar's celebrated poem, My Country. I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. This, I think, captures perhaps the heart of what we might be wanting to talk about here today with our guest, who's written a book, Drought Country, The Dry Times That Have Shaped Australia, published by CSIRO 2024. And basically this is an environmental history of Australia, and particularly droughts, and particularly of the important role that hydroclimate can play in the development of human settlement, and particularly, of course, in Australia. And this book covers some 3 centuries of Australian experience with drought and the ways in which we've responded to it and the sort of impacts that it's had. The author is Robert Godfree. Robert is a research scientist with the CSIRO. He's an ecologist. Thanks very much for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches, Robert.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Robert, what was the reason for you wanting to put this together, and why do you think this was in the face of an apparent silence and lack of documentation of what you've done here?
There's several reasons why I decided to put this book together. The first is that I experienced quite a few droughts in my life. I was raised on a farm up in northern New South Wales, and the earliest drought that I remember was a terrible drought in 1982, and it affected me quite greatly as a young child. And since then, and owning land in that part of the world, I've had to confront droughts throughout that time, and the Millennium Drought from between 2001 to 2009, and then later droughts more recently. So I've had a lot of direct experience. And I've been lucky enough to also consider some of the more scientific aspects of drought while working for the CSIRO over the last 25 years or so. I guess the time came when I felt that I had enough knowledge about the topic to think about writing a book, and I had originally wanted to focus perhaps on some of the older droughts, particularly the Federation drought, because very little information is actually out there on these old droughts. As you mentioned, there is something of a silence about it. I can't say whether that's just due to or why that's the case, but there's not a lot of detailed and rich history on those droughts. So I decided to put that together, and over time that evolved into the drought book that I wrote.
Perhaps we could start at the top with a basic question about what defines a drought and what makes Australia a particularly drought-prone country, which I believe it is. What is it in the statistics and data that shows us what we face here with the variability and noisiness of rainfall data, I guess?
Right. So I think most people will be familiar with the sort of traditional concept of a drought, which is just really a very long dry period, rainless period. I mean, that's the colloquial use of the term. But it's also the case that as we consider more detail, I think we're really interested in the impacts of those droughts on agriculture, environment, human societies, and so forth. So when people talk about the worst droughts, we're really considering the impact on people and systems. So what became quite apparent to me through writing this book was that there have always been extremely dry periods in Australia, stretching back 300 years and obviously much longer. But the impact on human societies and agriculture and so on have changed significantly during that time. So maybe that's something we could talk about later. But fundamentally, then, we're dealing with the interaction between climatic drivers. And as you mentioned, droughts are prevalent in Australia and have always been so. I think there's some good evidence to suggest that droughts are particularly severe and protracted in Australia. And certainly there are climatic reasons for that. I mean, a lot of Australia is semi-arid to arid, experiences extreme volatility in rainfall. It's situated between rain bands from the tropics and from the mid-latitudes to the south. So it is naturally affected by significant changes in many climatic drivers that produce rain or droughts. We have a lot of data to back that up. There's very good rainfall data now being constructed back to the early 1900s across the continent, and then further back using proxy records, measurements on sedimentology and other attributes of Australian landscapes and systems that you can infer the impact of changes in rainfall from. So fundamentally, I think that that's why we're interested in drought in Australia. And I would also say that from a human point of view, Australia is actually, while it's the driest continent outside of Antarctica, Australia's deserts and semi-arid areas are actually not that extremely dry. They're not hyper-arid, say, like parts of Saudi Arabia or most other deserts. They're arid. They're dry, but they do get periods of intense rainfall, and it can be quite wet in Central Australia for many years at a time. And I think that and combined with the agricultural history of the continent is why droughts have been so pronounced and their impacts on people so devastating across the continent.
We can almost start from the first settlement really around Sydney and some of the earlier droughts during that period. But really, we had a society there confronted with trying to feed itself in a very different climatic environment and finding that rather difficult and needing to find solutions beyond importing food, which they had to do for a long time, to try to keep themselves going. And of course, their responses and reactions to all of this was to expand, wasn't it? So they moved out of Sydney and out into the Parramatta, where arguably things might have been a bit better, and then they found that they had to cross over the Blue Mountains and get into the big Western Plains, which they then proceeded to invest in and exploit. So already the hydroclimate, if you like, is dictating or directing the pattern and nature of development, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I mean, you mentioned several droughts in there, and yes, it certainly. Look, drought played a critical role right from the very earliest days of settlement. So the settlement drought was probably one of the worst droughts that's actually occurred, I think, probably in the last 300 years. We only really know much about it from the Sydney Basin, but it was certainly pronounced there. And I think that if you had actually been a convict working the fields in Parramatta during that particular drought, you would consider it to be one of the worst droughts in Australian history from a human impact point of view. I mean, there was starvation and terrible deprivations caused by that drought. It also was coupled with very severe heat waves in that particular drought. There were many examples, I guess, of birds and flying foxes that were killed during the terrible heat that occurred during that drought. And often drought is coupled with heat across Australia in general. So the answer, as you say, yes, that's correct. People moved to it was not just drought, but it was also the sort of poverty of the soil in around the eastern Sydney Basin that caused people to move out and try to seek better soils in the Parramatta region, which was successful. It was very difficult for the first few years, but over time, agricultural production did increase, and that, of course, was also driven somewhat by expansion of grazing industries towards the Blue Mountains and Campbelltown and that region through there. So that was how people dealt with that drought, was to expand. Then there was a very severe drought between 1813 and 1815, and there was some dry periods leading up to it, which caused devastating stock losses and probably Australia's first example of population collapse in cattle and sheep due to drought. That definitely was the stimulus for early exploration over the Blue Mountains into the Bathurst region. Although that drought had largely finished by the time large-scale cattle movement had happened, certainly that was the driver. And I think you could say by about 1813 to 1815, settlement was well and truly expanding into the interior. And I think that the immediate issue of food was not so pressing for most of the colony. And so, yes, dead right. Expansion was the way to overcome drought in those days.
So expansion was one way of overcoming things, but then progressively, as we moved through into the 19th century and the development of pastoralism and what have you, and the intensive stocking and development of land, they too had to confront some of the questions about the basic carrying capacity and need to recognise that whatever landscape they were working in at the time had its own particular limitations. So how did the droughts, particularly in that era, and what were the main droughts that brought about a realisation about the need to look at their land management and stocking practices, and how did they do that?
Well, look, I would argue that that's still a work in progress, to be honest. It certainly took many, many decades for for the idea of carrying capacity to even be considered in a formal way. Certainly in any kind of scientific or sort of professional writing, it was just not out there in any meaningful way. Probably until, well into the mid 1800s. So later droughts that, let's say in the early to mid 1800s, again, expansion was often the way to deal with those droughts. So it was a terrible drought towards the end of the 1820s, and one of the answers to that was to expand into the interior of Australia, further into interior New South Wales, southern Queensland, and then the overland route across to South Australia. So I would argue that there was actually very poor understanding of the limitations for stocking capacity in Australian systems. So Australia had large areas of open grassy woodlands. It was apparent, I think, within 10 to 20 years of the first cattle arriving in Australia that those systems could be degraded and that was greatly accelerated during drought. But there was no doubt that there were massive stock losses in the 1820s and then another terrible drought in the 1830s, which led up to depression in the early 1840s. So there was a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of the carrying capacity of systems. That notion was not really, I think, prevalent during an area of frontier expansion. And then it was really not until the I would say mid to late 1800s where those ideas came to the fore. Now, once land had been settled, that was a different story. And when there was no further room for expansion, then people started to take that much more seriously. But I can tell you from personal experience that overstocking is a problem today. And I think it's also the case that many Australian inland regions have essentially no carrying capacity or next to nothing during the worst droughts. So it's always been a terrible problem for Australian agriculture and continues to this day. But that said, there have been many improvements and better understanding. And, there's fantastic models that are available to help people manage livestock numbers through drought.
Our guest on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beaches is Robert Godfree. He's the author of a remarkable environmental history, if you like, of Australia over 3 centuries called Drought Country, the dry times that have shaped Australia. Robert, it's one thing for the drought to bring to the fore the questions of the destocking and death of stock and the hardship that brings about for the people, and people have to react to that by perhaps adjusting land management practices. But subsequent droughts and droughts over time have come to demonstrate through their occurrence that one drought and then followed by other changes can degrade the landscape itself and actually hinder the ability of the land to recover and be resilient once the droughts break. I'm thinking particularly about the role that droughts have had in the recognition of questions. We had huge soil erosion and loss, didn't we, in our agricultural systems and landscapes?
Absolutely. I would say that Australia's probably suffered more degradation from drought than probably any other continent, certainly as a whole. And I think many of the worst examples in Australia are probably, among the worst ever seen anywhere. I mean, when I was going to university back in my younger days, one of the quotes I came across was that ecologists live in a land of scars. And when you drive around Central Australia, most of New South Wales, virtually the entire continent, it's an extremely degraded land, extremely degraded. And droughts have played an absolutely critical role in that. So you mentioned soil erosion. That's absolutely one of the big drivers. Large amounts of soil, in some cases, many feet of soil have been lost, often in sandier areas. There was a Dust Bowl period from about 1900 to 1945 that caused immense loss of soil and sand drift in southeastern Australia and central Australia. But just the impact of grazing and loss of topsoil and then tremendous dust storms that occurred during that period caused immense loss of soil. And of course, once the topsoil and the humus is disappeared, then the soil has a much lower capacity to retain water. That was noticed by the 1820s to 1830s in the Sydney region, and I guess the central tablelands and slopes of New South Wales, where creeks that had been formerly ephemeral became permanent because of the loss of topsoil and its absorbing capacity following rain. So there's substantial changes, and of course that flowed all the way through the system, through to riparian systems and so on. But also droughts have had a huge impact on vegetation. I think there's very strong evidence that droughts have always killed trees, shrubs, and woody vegetation and grasses across Australia, even in the pre-grazing era. But of course, coupled with large numbers of stock, then we had permanent vegetation change. And I think in Western New South Wales, if perhaps some listeners have travelled through that country, you'll find that it takes decades or centuries for that land to recover. And then to that, I would add the fact that In terms of native mammals and other native animals, the loss has been equally great, and that extinction is forever. So there've been dozens of species have been lost, and I think I outline in my book there that the drought played a key role in that, extending all the way from the 1830s through to the Federation drought and beyond. But that was a critical period for a species lost. They were just not able to cope with the loss of vegetation, predation by foxes and cats, coupled with competition from grazing. So a number of drivers there, but yes, the environmental impacts of drought coupled with modern agricultural practices have been quite devastating for the continent and continue to be.
As you tell
That's
us
okay.
in the book, an indigenous word for drought is aluru. And of course, indigenous people have lived with this climatic variability and unpredictability and magnitude and severity for millennia, really. You talk in your book about their knowledge and their reactions to it, the little we can find out about that. What was their knowledge and strategy, if you like, for dealing, as far as we can tell, with these features of our hydroclimate?
Well, immense knowledge. And to be honest with you, Michael, it was difficult. I wrote a lot of this book during COVID. And so it was challenging to get out and talk to local traditional owners through Central Australia to learn more about that. But what is definitely the case with my experience in Central Australia is that it took an absolutely incredible amount of knowledge to survive in these landscapes, adapt your land use patterns to the availability of water. And I think something that's often overlooked is just that even for Aboriginal societies, I think there's quite good evidence that in large parts of the continent, the droughts were absolutely devastating. Now, obviously, there are no written records going back beyond, let's say, 1880s in Central Australia, but from what I could determine, was very, very significant impact, and including starvation and even a lot of death from thirst in certain parts of Central Australia following a tremendous period of drought, particularly during the 1820s, 1920s and 1930s. So I don't really want to opine terribly on the. I think it would be better to talk to Aboriginal people about their particular experiences with drought. I just have a great admiration for the amount of skill that was required to survive in Central Australian landscapes, particularly during drought, and I'm sure it affected most of the continent at certain times, and that terrible hardships were also experienced by people there as well. And I think there's also good evidence that during the last glacial period, which was much drier than modern Australian climatic conditions, significantly lower rainfall, mobilization of sand dunes in Central Australia to a level that we don't see today, much lower vegetation cover, and that it was so severely dry that Aboriginal populations were substantially reduced throughout Central Australia, particularly in desert regions. So I think, like us, there were technological limitations. There were certain amounts of information available, a rich history passed down traditionally, and so people did an incredible. I think it was an incredible achievement to survive in those landscapes, and I'm sure that if you've been out in those places during the worst droughts, then it gives you a sense of admiration for what was achieved.
One of the insights you give us in the book is the thinking that's developed around what I think you've called catastrophe science. And in particular, as I understand it, the proposition is that you get cumulative building effects that can lead to critical tipping points in the landscape and the ecological system. In other words, you can get an event of a certain intensity, a drought or whatever. It can destroy and damage the environment and it can recover. But this theory seems to go to the point that if we get sequences of these and of increasing intensity, what can happen is that we reach a tipping point and that recovery basically is, well, it's irreversible damage.
Yes, I mean, I think so. We have, I think, two competing models to consider. One of them is, as you say, the catastrophic model, which does involve tipping points, non-linear relationships between different drivers of climatic change and landscape degradation and so on. And then a sort of more iterative type of model where, you get cumulative building up of environmental change caused by subsequent droughts over decades. I think both are true, to be honest. I think Australia's history has been a long-term, just a multi-decadal process of gradual damage and degradation with certain periods of recovery during wetter times. but that the overall trajectory of a lot of Australian systems that are affected by drought is towards slow impoverishment. This is not to say that there have not been incredible achievements in land reclamation and so on over time. So obviously agricultural systems have become somewhat better at adapting to drought and to causing less damage. There are many examples I could give you of that. But there are also these nonlinear catastrophic type effects, and I think that perhaps the situation of the Murray-Darling been one of those, where there was relatively small change in those systems despite ongoing regulation of water from the late 1800s in Victoria, New South Wales in particular, and then spreading across the entire Murray-Darling Basin. There was a little impact on flow and ecosystems during the 1902 drought, which was one of the worst of all time. But gradually, over time, with the restriction of more extraction of water for agricultural purposes, there was really even under those conditions, there was actually very little change observed in those systems, even through the 1940s, and that was a very, very dry period. But as we've all seen, since 2000 in particular, has been a really shifting into a new paradigm, a catastrophic shift, I think, in the decline of those riverine systems due to the combination of agricultural water extraction, to a smaller extent mining, domestic purposes, and then a whole range of other drivers, probably some degree of climate change, shifting of droughts towards southern Australia more than the north, and so on. So I guess I would give you those two examples, is that we have this iterative process that's always been occurring in many systems, but I think riparian systems are a great example of where regime shifts really do matter, and they can be sudden and extreme. And I don't think that most people in, say, 2000 were really prepared for what was coming in the Murray-Darling. And obviously the billions of dollars and that were spent trying to remedy the situation with varying degrees of success, I think reflect that kind of a model.
You've spoken or mentioned a couple of times and certainly write a lot about the so-called Federation drought, but I believe in that section too, you talk about the concept of nature taking revenge on perhaps, is it the hubris, the pride and the boasting perhaps of civilizations? I think you call it Niobe's ruin, don't you? This is a
Right.
story of turning to
Yeah.
stone because of pride.
Well, this is a very interesting time. It was really recounting the way that people at the time, and especially intellectuals, were looking at the impact of this horrendous drought and how it crushed the ambitions of pastoralists across most of Central and Eastern Australia at the time. So the Federation drought lasted from, let's say, 1895 to 1903. 1902 being the worst year. It was a tremendously severe drought, and it caused, it was, I think, in terms of agricultural impact in Australia, probably the worst drought that's occurred. And there are many rainfall records set during that drought that have never been surpassed. It was a very severe time. It also coincided with the sort of romantic area of literature. And so that was, I think, some of the people that I quote who traveled through the country would try to really make sense of the devastation. And I don't know if you, Michael, have been out to that country during a severe drought. Well, I've been through those places where there's not a blade of grass for miles and miles and miles, where the rivers are all dry, cattle, sheep, emus, kangaroos lying dead across the landscape in huge numbers. And during heat waves, birds and other animals dying, fish dying in rivers. It's a real devastating personal thing to actually experience, I think. And that's true of local landowners, people who live out there, and also for people who are passing through. So there was a lot of optimism in the 1880s and early 1890s through a series of wet years, very high wool prices at certain times. There was a real sense, I think, that the sky was the limit for agricultural and grazing production in those landscapes. And the Federation drought just devastated those systems. It was worse than anything since the 1830s, probably, and maybe worse than that. And it really did mark a change. It marked a shift from thinking of those systems as basically systems where you can continually expand relentlessly, and where great optimism can be found in agricultural lifestyles and expansion, to one where just sheer survival was the order of the day. And honestly, those extreme conditions lasted from 1895 up until the mid 1940s, periodically. So when I'm talking about, the hubris, it seemed that I think that there was a general sense that people who were moving out into those areas didn't understand the severity of droughts in Australia, and that this was some sort of like a reckoning being, brought back into line by the environment and by the Federation drought.
Here with our guest Robert Godfrey. We're talking about his book Drought Country, the dry times that have shaped Australia. Robert, you did mention the River Murray and the Millennium Drought, and I suppose the Millennium Drought around the River Murray precipitated a big environmental crisis, and it made people realise, I think you've called it kidney failure, that the entire system depended on this and was ravaged by this through these cascading changes, and that it was a systemic problem that needed broad institutional and political action, which was taken in a sense, but arguably perhaps not fully effectively. It's this systemic issue that confronts us, isn't it, in trying to deal with drought. It's not just responding to a given drought and individual farmers having to respond and landholders.
No, it's not. Absolutely. The Murray-Darling Basin is huge, covers a lot of different political jurisdictions, many different land use types. It also has a number of cities within it now. And absolutely, it's a diabolical, I'd say, geographical, demographic and political issue. And coupled with that, well, we have significant competing demands for water across those systems. And on top of that, of course, we have the incoming issue of climate change, which is expected to significantly alter flows in those systems going forward. Estimates vary, but it's quite possible to see 15 to 20 or 30% decline in flows in rivers throughout Western New South Wales, I guess, in the Murray and the Darling systems combined, and other systems in Australia, to be honest. So yes, I would agree with you. It's a very complicated issue. I was involved with some of the environmental work that went on, and so there's been in the Murray-Darling area, and particularly in the Barmah Forest, there's been real serious effort at trying to manage the remaining water that is available to the environment in a more efficient way, identifying certain systems that require watering at certain times and certain volumes to keep them healthy. So I think there's been a lot of great work done. The fundamental issue, though, is that I still think that a lot of water is being taken from the system, and when you have extremely severe droughts, there's just not enough water to go around. So this was seen again in the terrible drought from 2017 to 2019, 2020. I mean, the bushfires are the most famous part of that, the Black Summer, but the drought was tremendously severe and caused dieback of fish and other animals across the Darling. So yeah, look, this is definitely a work in progress, but it's very acute, and I think will rear its head again in the next drought that we have.
Here with our guest Robert Godfrey talking about his book Drought Country, thinking about how we get into this situation and how we get out of it as a society. You talk about the Cassandra problem, and you speculate about why it is that we don't seem to be able to take ourselves out of these catastrophes, when really we have certainly had a lot of knowledge and do have knowledge, and arguably have had knowledge way back about some of these things. What do you speculate on why we've got this, what you call a deficit of social agency in this area?
Yeah, this was something that I was not really expecting when I went through this work. I think the conventional wisdom is that a lot of the reasons why management of droughts is not perform better today is that there's just not enough data, there's not enough information, say in the or earlier droughts to the same degree. So people will say that the Federation drought was so devastating because people just didn't know how bad a drought could be. But this is just patently not true. Countless examples of extremely severe impacts of drought on landscapes across Australia, going all the way back to settlement. They were written about, and for people who were willing to get to dig, that information was there, and it was also passed down among people living in drought-stricken areas. I can't tell you exactly why it is that so many of these past lessons have been forgotten on so many occasions. I think it's a very interesting question. From my own personal experience growing up in Australia and in northern New South Wales, I think that the Millennium Drought was a real circuit breaker, because prior to that, there had been several decades of quite wet conditions. Yes, there were some droughts in there, but it was generally wetter, and people had come to forget, I think, some of the lessons that were learned from that earlier mega drought period in the early 1900s. So definitely things seem to be shifting. I'm hoping that by putting this book together, that there's a good record of these historic droughts, their impacts, and so that people won't have to dig so deeply to try to find that information. And I do think that there's a cultural shift going on in Australia, where it's recognized now that long periods of drought have very significant ramifications for the society as a whole. And my hope is that during wetter periods like right now, that's not forgotten, and that planning continues through those specific periods, so that we aren't faced with this repetitive sort of catastrophic cycle of new impacts, or what appear to be new impacts, but are really just obvious manifestations of old problems across the continent.
Well, thank you very much, Robert Godfrey. Finishing on a relatively optimistic note, because your 3 centuries history of failure and excesses, I think it could be characterized as, and you describe it as that, does seem to provide, though, a history which is food for the optimist and for the pessimist. We can find resilience, adaptability, and change, but ultimately failure and excess, perhaps. Thank you, Robert Godfrey, for joining us on Innovation Talk, Radio Northern Beaches. Robert?
Thank you very much for having me, Mike. I've appreciated it.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. And most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.